back with some watercolor tips for you. I hope they will be useful for you in the future. There are some basic tips that I found out really helps while I paint. First of all, I always have a pad to which I tape the paper. It's much better to tape it to a pad than to a table because I like to move my canvas around when I paint, so it's easier. It can be just a cardboard to prevent your canvas from curling when adding water to it. There are different types of washi tape that you can use. These thin ones are ideal for swatches like these. And there are the thicker ones, they are better for securing the paper. I don't use Hobby Market painting tapes because they always tear my paper apart. Here I show you how to secure a paper by a washi tape, but you can also use the metal pins for it. I recommend them for when you are using a sketchbook. Basically you just take the corners of your pages and pin them together. But make sure to not take them off until your drawing is fully dried. The next tip is to sketch lightly, as it is quite easy to damage the watercolor paper. You can even use a light box to trace your sketch. I always use mechanical pencil with color lids to sketch. I don't use light books much because I'm too lazy for that, plus the sketchiness of my works is something that I like. Having a good eraser is also quite important. I usually use kneaded eraser and Pentel high polymer eraser. Kneaded eraser is best when you want to pick up the graphite and leave light marks behind. Then just shape it a bit to clean it. Pentel eraser erases fully and it makes the eraser dust stick together. Next tip is to use a ceramic watercolor palette. There are many types, but even plain plate is fine. It works just as fine, but personally I like the flower shape the most because it has rounded containers and it's easy to use. They are also easy to clean. I really like that ceramic palettes are heavy and so they don't move around when I paint. Also any other palette, be it metal or plastic, is fine, just as long as you use one, because when I started using watercolors I didn't use any palette at all, can you believe it? I found out that on ceramic palettes you can mix the colors very good, as the paint won't scatter in spots, as it does on metal and plastic palettes. And unlike on plastic palettes, it won't leave any stains. For cleaning a ceramic palette you just need a wet towel and you wipe it off with it and you are done. Towel and paper towels are my best friend. For watercolor it is essential to control the water flow, which you can adjust by just dipping it in the paper towel a bit. I also use it to clean my brushes. Another tip is to prepare your paint before you use it. I always get water on the paint pans first and then let it sit for a while. I'm lazy, so I just use my brush to put a few drops on the paint, but you can as well use a pipette for it and spray it with water. Also, I usually don't use paint directly from the pan, but I will first put it to my palette and mix it with a little bit of water to achieve the effect I want to and to make it work how it's supposed to. It's important to use clean water if you want to have clean color. As watercolors tend to look different on paper than on the actual pen, my next tip is to always make swatches. It will make your work so much easier and they are extra fun to do. Now let's talk about the true essentials for painting. There exist different types of brushes, natural hair brushes and synthetic brushes, which both have their flaws and strengths. My favorite brush is Silver Black Velvet brush. It is a synthetic squirrel brush. It has really amazing point and it holds quite a lot of water. I use this brush for most of my paintings. I only have one natural hair brush and that is Art Secret Squirrel brush. It's perfect for use on wider areas and it holds a lot of water. I really love working with it. And now let's compare it to a typical cheap round synthetic brush. It doesn't hold much water, but it is a bit sturdier, so it holds shape very nicely. Another type of brushes are flat brushes. They can be handy for filling bigger areas or just making swatches. This is a flat brush from Jackson's. I really like it for making swatches. When comparing it to a cheaper brush, I don't see much difference. They both don't hold too much water. Now let me show you the real reason why I hated watercolors so much in elementary school. Do you see these brushes? It's impossible to use them correctly. You can't really make any details with them. And to be honest, just looking at them makes me cringe. Well, maybe they can be used for some specific effects. There are different types of effects you can achieve with different brushes, so in the end it all depends on what you want to do. Here you can see a comparison of them all when they dried already. Next really important topic is the paper. It's essential to use watercolor paper when working with watercolors and not just printer paper or sketching paper. I wouldn't even recommend mixed media paper, even though that is much better than the two previous options. There are different types of watercolor papers and the outcome will look different depending on which paper you use. This is very well visible with the granulation effect. It's totally different depending on the texture of the paper. As for the watercolor paper, there are two basic types, hot press and cold press watercolor paper. In my sketchbook that I use in most of my videos, there is a hot press watercolor paper, but to be honest, I had to get used to it. I actually prefer cold press watercolor paper because it allows you to work with more water and I like its subtle texture more. The downside of using cold press paper is that the colors are more muted, whereas on the hot press they look more vivid. There also exist cotton watercolor papers, but I don't have much experience with them yet. Here I'm showing you a comparison of what happens when you use watercolor on printer paper, sketch paper and different hot press and cold press papers. The effects vary greatly, but I purposely didn't tape any of the papers with washi, so that you can see the curling of the paper even easily. The printer paper just got completely soaked and the paint was just flowing on it, leaving the paper later to be completely curled. The sketch paper was a tiny bit better, but the paint got immediately soaked into the paper and was left there permanently. Whereas on the watercolor papers, you can layer paint, lift it, move it where you want, and so on. With watercolor papers, the main difference is in the textures, vibrant or muted colors, and the amount of water you want to work with. For example, if you would like to use wet on wet technique, the best bet would be to use the cold press paper. You may also notice the hot press cotton paper is acting totally differently than all the other papers, but it's there just for comparison, then I will have to study it more to talk about it. Last but not least, let's talk a bit about the watercolor paint itself. Here the most important tip would be to prefer quality over quantity. Honestly, I can't stress this enough. I would much rather invest into a set of 6 split primary colors or even 3 basic primaries than to paint with student grade watercolors. I'm comparing here handmade paint my friend gave me, thank you, with the Kohinoor Anilinki dyed based paint, and it's very cheap and used by children here. And no name old watercolors that I found, and artist grade Daniel Smith watercolors. Each of these paints make different effects again. I'm using French ultramarine color or colors that are close to it as possible in the cheaper watercolor sets. The handmade paint has bigger pigment particles, which makes this paint beautifully unique and very rich. Dye-based paint is very concentrated and it's hard to tone it down. It doesn't granulate at all and it soaks into paper immediately. It's also very hard to lift and overall it acts more like ink than a watercolor. The finish layer is very chalky. This cheap paint I found is quite nice, actually, for what it is. It's very old and we can see there is a lot less pigment in it than the professional watercolors, but it still works nicely. I don't have any student quality paint or the typical elementary school watercolors to show you, sadly. The Daniel Smith watercolor is just perfect in my opinion. The granulation effect is nice and it's very pigmented and the pigment particles are finer compared to handmade paint. Overall, a pleasure to work with. Here is a quick show of what watercolor looks like when it's dry. You can compare them. You can see clearly the difference. Here is just a quick show of what color mixes you can get from just the split primaries. What more you need, right? Anyway, if you like this episode, don't forget to leave this video a like and subscribe to my channel. It really helps a lot. Hope you will have a lovely week and I will see you in the next video. Bye!